3 HOA board members, Dennis Marsha and their puppet enforcer, Greg, stood at the edge of my front field with freshly printed violation notices and smug little grins. They had just finished hanging neon orange property and violation signs along my ranch fence posts like they were decorating for Halloween, and when Marsha saw the barrel in my hands, her lips curled into a sneer.
I knew that nothing would be the same again the moment I raised my rifle and told them to leave my property. You point that thing at us, we'll call the cops, she shouted, her voice as shrill as the wind whistling through the mosque trees. You step.
One more foot past that marker, I said, slowly, calmly, and I won't be pointing it anymore. I'll be protecting what's mine. That was it. Greg, sweating like a hog in church, fumbled with his phone and dialed 911. He even made sure to say the words, loud enough for my security cameras to hear. Yes, we're at Fairview. Ranch Estates. A man's pointing a gun at us. He's threatening us. He didn't mention that I was standing on my own property. He didn't mention that they had trespassed over a clearly marked no HOA access line. He didn't mention that the so-called violation they were complaining about was a simple water collection system I'd installed, perfectly legal, by the way, to help during drought season. By the time the county sheriff's trucks came barreling up the long dirt road, my dogs were barking, the goats had scattered, and a small crowd of neighbors had started gathering at the property line, cameras out, phones up, eyewitnesses whispering. What happened next? Well, let's just say it wasn't what the HOA expected. But before we get to that, you should know how it all began, because it wasn't a sudden blow-up over rainwater and landlines. Rather, it was years in the making, and it all began with a handshake. My name is Clint Foster, and I'm a 52-year-old retired firefighter and proud owner of a 10-acre ranch on the outskirts of southern Texas, just past the dusty edge of Collin County. My grandfather built this property, my father bled on it, and I've spent the last 20 years transforming it into something useful, including livestock, rainwater systems, solar panels, food crops, and even a barn that I renovated myself. I live here with my golden retriever tank, and occasionally my niece Casey stops by from college to assist. Breaks. Everything was peaceful until the HOA started to snoop around. As you can see, the county rezoned portions of our rural region for residential expansion approximately 5 years ago. I didn't believe initially. A few gated communities appeared close to the highway's side, and then they crawled one by one. I wasn't invited to the Fairview Ranch Estates HOA's formation. They sent me a welcome packet, even though I was technically only 4 acres inside the zone limits. I laughed and threw the bill and the list of regulations in the garbage, which was my first. Initially, it was just letters, but soon the random drop-ins appeared on the HOA board. Members began arriving at my gate to point out infractions such as hanging old tools and signs on my barn wall. They sought to fine me because I had an ugly water trough in my goat corral, which was too close to the fence. In keeping with the neighborhood, I chose to ignore them, and they didn't like Dennis, a wiry man with gray hair, the board president, golf tan lines in a Napoleon complex, pretended to be owned the entire zip code, and Marsha, the secretary, always wore church attire, even when she wasn't up, only to gauge my grass's height, and Greg was the muscle, but he was a nobody, attempting to be someone else, and the only strength he had was behind a clipboard and a whistle. People's land before the rainwater system arrived. Texas summers are harsh, and we experienced, due to a 2-month drought last year that destroyed half of the local crops, I made an investment in a premium rain collecting system, gutters, barrels, filtration, and setup. I even assisted a couple. When the HOA discovered that their neighbors had misplaced theirs, they installed theirs for free. People complained that it didn't adhere to community standards and didn't suit the suburban image, Yet they didn't care despite the fact that the system was conserving water in an eco-friendly manner, it was not apparent from the road. Issued me 30 days warning to take it down. I formally appealed, but they rejected it. In after 10 minutes, I made the decision that I would not give up. And that's when the real difficulties began. When I got up in the morning, I discovered that my gate's locks had been altered according to the HOA. They were given permission to guard the community boundaries immediately after. Naturally, the claims of illegal behavior on my property were false, but it took, after 4 hours and the use of bolt cutters, Tank returned home later that week. Just over the fence line, I discovered a piece of contaminated meat with a limp. He might have died if they hadn't taught him not to eat anything off the ground. It's fortunate that I installed the new camera system because, a few nights later, someone trespassed onto my property while wearing a HOA polo shirt and marked my barrels with red X marks, and I brought the video to the sheriff's office. Nothing was done, so last Friday was the last straw. I received a verified letter from the HOA's attorney threatening to take down all of the unapproved installations if I didn't do so within 7 days. I wasn't sure what it meant to start forced compliance measures, but I waited and set up the camera feeds because it sounded like they were about to enter my property without permission. I shut up the barn and double-checked my fences, and sure enough, Monday morning, the HOA arrived without warning, carrying brochures for bolt cutters and a smug little smile. One barrel at a time, they planned to demolish my rainwater system. I took my gun out at that point. Before anyone assumes that this was about violence, this included a man protecting his property, and I didn't threaten them or pull out my rifle until they had over the fence line. I cautioned them. And only after. They disregarded every indication, every warning, I contacted the police marshal and offered Greg a chance at peace. Declaring her fundamental rights, Dennis appeared as though he had just eaten a sheriff's trucks, came roaring down the road, dust flying, sirens ringing, and I held my ground. My pulse was racing when I saw the flashing lights reflecting off the barn walls and rain barrels, but my hands remained still. The first constable went out with his hand on his rifle after lowering the tank barked. Slowly he added, "Holster eyes flashing between me and the HOA, sir." I obliged, placing the gun lightly on the porch and walking over here with my hands visible. I was moving slowly and steadily in his direction while my neighbors watched and my cameras were rolling. I had nothing to conceal, so the constable asked, "Can you tell me what's going on here?" I was about to say something when Marka abruptly stepped forward and waved her phone at me, his face, and placed the rifle directly at my head, threatening us. I had proof of a falsehood, but before I could say anything more, the constable grabbed for his cuffs, and everything ceased at that moment because his hand barely touched. Then, from behind the patrol truck, a booming yell sounded against his belt, and everything changed. "Hold!" Someone shouted from the crowd. "It's my neighbor Randy from 3. Retired state trooper, properties over huge guy, always wore his old cowboy hat. He rushed by the sheriff's deputies while brandishing his phone as a badge, as if it were a part of his cranium. Clint never pointed. "I got it on camera," he added, panting, "all of it. That firearm at anybody, not once." "Me too," said another voice. "I was recording." They were the ones who crossed the dividing line from the fence. He simply stood there without raising the barrel. Suddenly the deputy's gaze went from Marcia to Greg to Dennis. With more than 20 bystanders and an increasing number of phone cameras capturing them, each of them is suddenly getting smaller. Marcia, who was still crimson in the face, screamed every second and threatened us, saying, "I've got Randy said, you stated that you would take out his rain barrels whether or not he gave you permission. You claimed to have." Dennis moved back, his lips twitching, as a locksmith arrived breaking and entering on private property. Greg was now the lead deputy pretended to be invisible while staring at the sheriff like a scared child caught stealing candy. What they're saying about me is accurate. I pointed to my fully functional security system. He didn't indicate that he wanted to see the 4-angle, motion sensor, audio, and time-stamped footage. I only nodded briefly to his companion, who entered my porch and began going over the screen for 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, the cuffs were removed, and the HOA was requested to vacate my property. The sheriff apologized after 15 minutes, but the situation didn't end there because, even after the constable cautioned them not to set foot on my property, and they were removed off it. Without a warrant once more, I could see Dennis's hatred and resolve in his eyes, the embarrassment he couldn't tolerate. And that evening, Casey called me from Uncle Clint. She began in a tremulous voice. I noticed you trending on my stomach fell when I heard the phrase trending on TikTok. She paused and said that someone recorded the scene where the constable reached for his gun and Marsha grabbed the weapon. It has already received 600,000 views, and they are referring to you as Ranch Rambo. The man who confronted the HOA repeated, Blink Ranch. What Ranch Rambo? I genuinely chuckled for the first time in a long time when everyone said you were a hero. Weeks or months, but Casey went on to say, some people are suggesting you were too hostile. They are unaware of the whole incident that made me stop smiling. Since I was aware of how things operated in this nation, a 15-second video clip was all that was needed to spark a fire. Out of context and the appropriate hashtags, I was on the verge of becoming the catalyst for something more significant. The next morning news vehicles arrived. I'm not sure how they learnt so quickly. Perhaps someone alerted them via social media, because by 9 a.m. I had Channel 7 and Tank and Channel 5 were both parked at the end of my driveway with microphones and enquiries that I didn't want to answer, wasn't timid. He yelled till I eventually came out, frowning and holding a cup of coffee. Mr. Foster, what truly occurred yesterday? Was that gun loaded? Inquired one reporter. Cried out, do you regret your actions? I sipped slowly and placed the mug on the pork rail and stated merely this. I protected my land in the same way as my grandfather did. That quote alone garnered me 3 million views and a mention of the Constitution. Someone formed a T-shirt queue without asking, but my notoriety didn't shield me. Things deteriorated that week, beginning with a letter from the HOA's lawyer said that I had broken the community safety clause and that they were formally removing my water systems. The inspection followed a potential injunction against my ranch operations. Unmarked low-flying drone passed over my property at 6:45 a.m. and recorded, I called the sheriff last summer about everything, including my barns, solar panels, and the spot where I buried my old septic tank. When Casey came to visit that weekend, he reiterated that there wasn't much he could do if it didn't hit the ground. I didn't like the dark circles under her eyes.
And I hadn't seen her in person for months. You okay, kiddo?
I questioned. Shrugged. Uncle Clint, people are already creating stories on the internet. One guy said that you had a secret armament hidden out back, and another stated that you had threatened a mother and her kid. I groaned. Possess a barn.
Hay bales and an old tractor. She replied, yeah, but you've his enemies as well. I looked at her closely now, and for the first time since the beginning of this entire affair, I felt worn out, not physically.
But I couldn't sleep that night, since I was so exhausted from playing defense and fighting shadows. Continued to examine the camera tank while sleeping near the front door, and I noticed that the ears were twitching. Examined every lock, motion, sensor, and backup generator, and then sometime after 2 a.m., that the tripwire sensor I had installed was the cause of the alarm, not the cameras. I took the gun tank and let it grumble low along the tree line at the back fence. Already on guard, I carefully opened the rear door and into the moonlight. 3 figures in dark garb were moving quickly with instruments in their hands when I observed them. They were going directly for my barn after scaling the back fence, so I raised the rifle and yelled loud enough to wake them. One of them froze another, and the dead stop is when you are on private property. I knew this wasn't a joke when he ran directly at me on the third. I fired a warning shot into the ground just inches from his feet, but he dropped it since it was an attack rather than a warning. The others were gone in an instant, but the harm had already been done. Ran out with wide eyes, and I didn't respond since I was already. I had the video this time when I called the sheriff again, but more than that, I had a name and a key card, not just any key card, had been dropped by one of the intruders. I discovered this when I obtained a Fairview Ranch Estates HOA access badge. Wasn't over. This was war. And I didn't know the name of the person on the badge, Bryce T. Henley. The man not directly, but a little internet check revealed that he served as the HOA's elected community compliance enforcer, a young, attractive man in khakis wearing a hired gun, carrying a clipboard and a Bluetooth headset, and a huge superiority complex that required its own inbox. But now, because I had evidence that he had entered my property in the middle of the night with 2 unidentified people, thanks to that key card and my surveillance cameras. When the sheriff returned that morning with a crowbar and bolt cutters in tow, his tone had changed. He promised to take the matter to the county DA after watching the video and taking pictures of the key card. But I wasn't keeping my breath. I saw how slowly the system operated, particularly when interacting with these people. Knew how to play the grey areas when it came to HOA issues. And they would allege that Bryce was Casey, stood next to me as they called it a miscommunication, whether it was rogue or off-duty. They always managed to work things out. What now? The sheriff folded her arms across her breast. I glanced as she asked. I had spent years and sweat sowing the fields across the property at my barn and barrels. I then said, "We get ready." I worked like a man possessed for the next 2 days. Strengthened the perimeter fence, added solar power, and rewired the camera systems. I even installed a loudspeaker system connected to my motion sensors. Motion lights and backup batteries. Before I even had to get out of bed, they would hear my voice, alerting them to the improper area of my land, but I didn't just go on defense. I began chatting with my neighbors to find out that I wasn't the only one who was annoyed by the Wilsons' 2 homes in the HOA. Down had been penalized for making noise with their wind chimes, so old man Morales had tow his barn twice since the color wasn't approved in advance. Despite the baker's good, a courteous couple in their early 40s had gotten a notification regarding their children's one night. 12 of us convened at my house. At a lemonade stand that was breaking zoning restrictions. I'm exhausted, furious, and this isn't just about me anymore. Told them that they had gone too far and that it was time to let them know that we weren't scared. Mrs. Wilson asked what we could do first. So I showed them the petition. I had already prepared an official request for the county board to look into the Fairview Ranch Estates, HOA, for misbehavior, trespassing, harassment, and power abuse. If we received sufficient signatures, a hearing would be required, and the HOA might be dissolved if the county discovered enough infractions. Even Morales, who could hardly hold a pen anymore, pressed his signature, wobbly M, into the paper as if it were a revolution. But although I knew it would take time, I continued to get ready, and the HOA did too, since 2 nights later I was given an Clint Foster versus Fairview Ranch Estates. HOA is summoned by an official court. Were suing me for recklessly putting community people in danger, emotional distress, and brand defamation. Marcia had filed a claim stating that my hostile presence kept her awake.
At night,
Dennis said Greg claimed that his blood pressure had increased and that he now flinches at the sight of barns because he had chronic anxiety. The thing that most impressed me was that they had a whole legal team with fancy suits from the city.law firm in a downtown building that most likely had its own lift. I didn't have a lawyer, but even though I still possessed the truth, the fear continued to sneak in. Tank was resting next to me as I sat outside on the porch the night before my court appearance, gazing up at the stars. Listen to the bullfrogs, croaking in the distance by the creek and the wind whispering through the trees on the same area where I grew up. It felt like it was sliding out of my grasp right now, but Casey brought me a cup of coffee and sat next to me, saying, "I despise them." I shook my head, saying, "Don't?" She became perplexed, asking, "What do you mean if we spend all our time hatred causes us to lose sight of the goal of this ranch? Peace, not just fences and barrels." She was silent about freedom and the importance of standing your ground with honor rather than resentment. At that point, she added, "I'm proud of you." Eventually, we arrived at court the following morning, and I was dressed in my nicest jeans and afresh. With a clipboard in hand, I went alongside my dad wearing a button-down shirt and his old belt-buckle case. Even the Wilsons arrived to sit in the video clip that Randy had brought. Like she was at a royal tea party, Gallery Marker wore a pearl necklace. Greg just looked sweaty, while Dennis looked arrogant in a navy suit. Their lawyer then got up. He aired the viral video first, portraying me as a violent vigilante driven by paranoia. Said that I had transformed the neighborhood into a hostile war zone, of course, and when it was my turn, I remained composed, and played the entire video, including the trespassing, the dangers posed by the drone, and the nighttime incursion as soon as I took up Miracle, as soon as I set it down. Randy spoke, followed by Morales, and then the judge listened to each baker individually, took notes, and observed every moment of each. After the video ended, he turned to face the HOA's legal team and remarked, This man was within his rights, hence the case should never have been brought." They attempted to argue, but the judge dismissed their case. But I didn't think it would be the end, since when I walked, news teams were waiting outside the courtroom once more, and Bryce Henley was standing next to them. However, this time he wasn't grinning. Instead, he had a formal notice of appeal letter that the HOA hadn't. As he passed me, he mumbled to himself, "This land isn't yours forever." As they were doubling down, I realized, old guy, that we hadn't yet arrived at the decisive battle. This was simply the 2 weeks later my mailbox exploded. Not literally, but it was quiet before the next storm. Felt as though there were numerous court filings, violation notices, threats, and fines, revisions to the HOA regulation, and even a printed pamphlet called Understanding. They were tightening the screws, which is acceptable community behavior for gun owners. The HOA's legal team had already asked for an emergency injunction to restrict potential damages, but the appeal was only the beginning. Their intention to prevent me from using firearms independently in order to cause harm to community members, property limits access to my ranch, and requires that my water systems be removed while more research is done. Investigation. I recall that this was a siege, not just a power trip. Casey and I are seated at my kitchen table, both of us staring at the pile of legal documents as we attempt to drown. She told us in the paperwork that it's a strategy to wear you out and make you give up. I said, "Then we'll swim harder." But I was really tired, and only one man with a dog a ranch, and a stubborn nature. They had lobbyists, attorneys, and their case had reached the county civil court, meaning they had a lot of money. I moved, since this was no longer going to be a small-town issue, and the legal battle would take weeks or months. Meanwhile, I waged a more subdued battle back home every day while the attorneys squabbled in air-conditioned courtrooms and suits. I kept the tank close, reviewed my video feeds, and checked my fences while teaching Casey how to wield the gun, identify mud tracks, and maintain composure when everything seems to be coming apart, and I followed a series of dusty trails across my acreage every evening, from the chicken coop to the barn roof, from the Emiskid forest to the Rear Creek, where I occasionally sat and simply observed I observed something as the sunset began to fade across the horizon. Unusual new tire tracks close to the rear tree line weren't mine. These were narrow, like a golf cart or a utility vehicle, and they weren't part of the sheriff's patrols. Casey's vehicle that is compact and agile and utilized to navigate confined spaces. I checked the cameras discreetly, but the tracks were simply out of frame. Since someone had been that evening, I set up a makeshift trail camera beneath a brush pile, with no infrared lights and a silent trigger that is so completely concealed that even Tank sniffed by it without giving it a second look, and 3 nights later I was rewarded by seeing the video in shock. A man wearing a cap and all black gloves crept in at 2:14 a.m. He stopped at the barrel system along the fence line, glanced around, and then sprayed. He dropped something into the tanks from a bottle, then he pulled out his phone, took a picture, and vanished back towards the trees. I stopped the video, and even with the hat on, it focused on his face. Lo, I was certain that it was the same Bryce, the HOA enforcer, who attempted to the same person who filed the appeal and warned me that my land wouldn't be mine forever, broke into my barn. I grabbed Tank, ordered Casey to stay inside, and drove away after my water became contaminated. With the video on a USB, to their credit, they went directly to the sheriff's office and took prompt action. This time, within 24 after issuing a warrant, they discovered Bryce at his condominium with 3 bottles of herbicide, a folder with thorough details on my ranch and the name Operation Dryland Arrangement, including the times of day I was typically taking walks, caused me to feel ill. This was now a personal strategic criminal case rather than a HOA violation. Bryce was immediately taken into custody for trespassing, vandalism, attempting to contaminate a water source, and, since the barrels provided water for my animals and occasionally the gardens of my neighbors, it was regarded as an act of news trucks were back neighbors, and the community burst due to agricultural sabotage, staged an impromptu demonstration outside my fence after Casey created a popular TikTok. Tank is seen sipping clean water, while a sign behind him reads, "You mess with one Texan, you mess with all of us." However, Dennis and Marker appeared even as Bryce was being carried away in handcuffs, stood with their arms folded, newly laundered, and a smile on their faces at the side of the road without saying a word. Casey responded no, to which I retorted,
Because they're not sorry. Didn't lose yet. As expected, I got an emergency notification the following morning from the A Fresh motion was submitted to the county clerk, this time not by the HOA board, but from a group of homeowners headed by
Dennis. Their appeal touts eminent domain to forcibly take over a piece of my property, the rationale enhancement of HOA community assets, and beautification initiatives that they requested my under, the pretext of community, my land, barn, water system, and legacy. So I watched the sunset from my fence one night, with my hands resting.
On the aged wood, Tank stood next to me, silent and motionless, as the wind rippled across the meadows.
If they want war, I told Casey, without turning around, and she nodded. We'll give them own. The following day, I contacted all of my former Marine friends. In local farming cooperatives, I trained veterans with friends, including a journalist I knew from a disaster relief trip. Years ago, they repeatedly reaffirmed, "We've got your back." The trucks arrived over the weekend, but there were no news vans or sheriffs to assist. The 3 military tents were erected close to the barn. One served as a community kitchen and the other as a legal office. The third served as a supply center for volunteers who were assisting in strengthening the ranch. My property had evolved beyond a simple residence. A stand and a black SUV arrived. At the end of my drive, shortly before sunset, I saw Councilman Gerald as he came out into Gravel Road. He was wearing a dark jacket with a county seal pin on his lapel. Blake arrived with a folder instead of a camera crew or a press badge, and a letter that altered everything was in that folder. He gave it to me silently, and I carefully opened. It Andrea'd the first sentence out loud. The County of Collin today notifies the Homeowners Association of Fairview Ranch Estates of an official inquiry into claims of illicit property and criminal conspiracy, misapplication of civil policy regulations, and seizure attempts, Casey gasped. I turned to face the councilman, who merely stated, He didn't inform me that the HOA had one final card, which none of us were aware of yet. Seen enough, we're stepping in. To perform a secret they had hidden in the zoning records, and when they'd had the potential to destroy everything I had constructed and safeguarded. The secret was an antique hand-drawn zoning sketch from more than 30 years ago, not just any map water-stained and yellowed. It was nestled between layers of new building permits at the county land office, displayed the original construction plans. For the Fairview Ranch Estates, and right in the heart of it, as clear as day, was a dotted red line that cuts across my barn and across my property, diagonally labelled in faded ink, and passing through my farms and my family's legacy. It said, set aside for a future phase of the Community Recreational Zone, or FER, or phase, had never occurred in the 1980s, 1990s, or even 5 years after the HOA was established. They were now displaying this map as though it was Dennis, the Holy Grail, had a news conference with a polished podium, a smart outfit, and a HOA banner, declaring that my land had always been a part of the larger plan the Fosters had. He flailed in the wind behind him. According to him, the ranch is situated immediately on land that was formerly allocated for. It has been neglected and underutilized in the community. Now is the time to put it back to its original use. For the folks I nearly choked on my coffee while observing it go uncared for and ignored during floods, this field provided food for neighbors, kept livestock during snowstorms, and collected rainfall that, when the latest drought struck, the people behind Dennis nodded on cue like performers reading from a cul-de-sac. A poor script. But what was most startling was that he was once more referencing eminent domain. The HOA formally requested that the county take possession of a 3.7-acre section of my ranch, supported by the map, rationale for building a public green area and recreation center to enhance the translation for the neighborhood, a parking lot with a gazebo. Although it had slowed down, the council's earlier probe had not stopped them. The HOA maintained that the land claim had precedent and historical merit despite ongoing investigations. The county would now have to determine if the map was reliable, and if so, I'd losing about half of my ranch. I recall that evening sitting in the barn, my hands clutching the side of. I could still make out the carvings my father made in the wood of his old workbench on the day he Tank laid at my feet, his ears twitching, and we erected it using the marks. we made when measuring the heights of the fence posts when I was barely 12. Casey entered silently with 2 mugs of chocolate at every sound, saying, "You haven't talked in." She handed me one and remarked, "More than an hour." And I muttered,
Around what, Uncle Clint? I mean, it's all in the papers.
"If it's worth it." She blinked. "The courtrooms and politics. What if I'm clinging to something that's already gone?" She put down her cup firmly enough. She claimed that this ranch is more than simply property. It's the only place where it can. Splash dot location that never seemed real. And you created it such that when I looked into her eyes, this time, it's quieter. If you stop fighting, they win. The following morning, I called my friend Marcus, an ex-Marine who is now AI, told the Austin land rights lawyer, who had previously been following the case, "I need you." And he responded right away. Say no more. 2 days later, he showed up with a strategy and files for the legal team. "That ancient map?" Marcus said tendilati, "This isn't a legal document, therefore he didn't buy it." When I turn it over, I see that there are no permission stamps, a signature, or a county seal. They're using it like scripture, but it's only a proposal doodle. So, I responded, we refuted it like heresy. Marcus dug deep, retrieved records, and spoke with the county. The original developer, who was amazingly still alive and residing in Arizona, was even located by planners, and what we discovered everything that the red dotted line was never intended for, blowing the doors off. Development, it denoted a temporary utility route that was utilized while building a road. The site was never designated for seizure in 1989, and the recreation note had been crossed out in the official blueprints after being penciled in by an intern. But this is where things went crazy, since Dennis knew that 6 months prior he had really seen the actual plans. We discovered the email in a forwarded thread from a whistleblower inside the HOA's administration after he asked them directly. Office, they had been lying and had the actual documents all along, with the evidence. At hand, Marcus sent a counter-movement to the county, challenging the eminent domain action, as well as accused the HOA of deceiving a county board. On the court date was scheduled. But before it arrived, something occurred that none of us could have predicted. As expected, Marcia broke when she approached, my gate by herself, pale and trembling, and requested to talk. I nodded while keeping my distance rifle slung over my back, but her voice trembled. I assumed they were doing this because she said, "The map is the poison, Bryce." I remained silent as she gazed down at us as we simply protected the neighborhood. My grandchildren play in your fields, in the dust between her shoes. I didn't sign up for this, Casey, stepping forward, so I'll take a drink from your barrels. I obeyed.
Orders, Marcia, but you supported them and submitted half the violations. She handed me a flash drive and murmured, "I didn't question anything until now."
What's I want any meeting recordings, emails, text messages, and threads. And she turned to go, and I watched her leave more slowly than she had never moved before. So we plugged the drive back in the barn, and the files were audio that shows Dennis boasting about sending the elderly man's correspondence to the law firm, debating how to manipulate the video from the rifle incident that night, including one communication to Bryce. Take care of the barrels quietly. There was too much evidence, and it reached the chamber just in time for the court hearing the next day. Was crowded with reporters, council members, neighbors, and even 2 State Dennis, the lawmaker, was standing at the front, fidgeting. His clothing was impeccable, but when it was our turn, Marcus put out the clear designs with little confidence. The judge took in all of the emails, audio recordings, lies, and manipulations. "Do you deny requesting these?" she asked, turning to face Dennis Mr. Callahan. Documents while posing as official others. Dennis opened his mouth to say something, but when Marcus pressed play, Dennis's voice could be heard on the tape. It makes no difference if the people don't check the official map. They only see lines and labels. The courtroom fell silent. After she remained mute, the judge dismissed her gavel motion to seize the land. Leadership will be subject to a formal assessment and a county probe that will be extended. Broke out, and while everyone grabbed Casey and sobbed, I just stood there, silent as I was completely exhausted from the bustle of the press cameras outside. However, I ignored it and gazed at the sky, the fields, and the fence line. It was either, I reasoned, that since the barn caught fire that evening and the sky was orange, the east side of the barn was already being licked by the flames when Tank's frantic barking roused me and smoke was coiling up until I raced out the door, as the air, like a signal flare, called for every spirit in this area to see what was happening. Behind me, barefoot Casey and I were choking as the heat hit us like a wall in the barn, and our hearts felt like they were on fire. "Isid," I yelled, and she was already on it. Her voice was shaking as she attempted to remain composed while speaking with the dispatcher. I took the hose close to the rear of the house and ran in the direction of the fire, dousing the sides to prevent it from spreading. When the fire department arrived, the goats had fled to the far end of the fence line, bleeding in fear. Recordy, time tires crunching across gravel, sirens blaring, but it was too. Lately, the barn fell on its own, and the roof was snapped by groaning wood beams, collapsed with a loud crack that reverberated throughout the fields, and I stood there with the water still streaming from my chest. The crowd reassembled, neighbors, reporters, and the hose in.
My hands was worthless. Deputies! Dennis appeared from the smoke with an overconfident and composed expression, stood over the fence line in a crisp polo shirt with arms without saying anything.
I dropped the hose and walked as if it were a victory parade. I yelled, "You did this!" And he shook his head tusk as I approached the barrier and glared him down. "You don't look good as a paranoid person, Clint. You broke into my barn, poisoned my water, and attempted to grab my land. Now you can't prove anything, so burn it." I switched roles as Deputy Harris, the younger of the two officers who had previously dealt with my case, actually stood next to me. Dennis's grin dimmed a little
as he continued, "We just might."
You see, I put a small solar panel on top of the barn roof when we rebuilt it last year to power the loft and motion lights art camera, which was a component of my do-it-yourself security grid, but I had overlooked it in the confusion. However, Marcus had not returned to the property after the fire was extinguished, and after the rubble was deemed safe, we recovered the burned remnants of the camera's shell and memory card, which somehow survived, and so did the video, which was grainy and dark, yet enough clear to show two males. And shortly after, one of the hoodies threw something through a shattered barn window, while the other carried a petrol can, spark, but the hoodie slipped aside just enough to see a face. Greg, the HOA's little errand guy with a silver SUV sitting in the background. The license plate belonging to Drumroll was visible at the road's edge. Marcia Reynolds, this was criminal conspiracy, arson, and attempted trespassing. It was no longer just HOA drama. Within hours after property destruction, Deputy Harris personally brought the video into the sheriff's office. Greg was retrieved. They discovered petrol residue in his pickup. Marcia Greg put up a fierce fight, but the evidence was compelling, and he gave in under duress. Revealed that Dennis had finished being polite, that the barn fire was intended to send a message, and the worst part, more planning had been done, and the HOA board had even talked about ways to influence local news and county land surveys, outlets, and issue restraining orders against my neighbors and me in order to keep us apart and at odds. It was a full-on operation, but now that everything was falling apart, the county council met again. They cancelled the Fairview Ranch Estates HOA's membership during that same week's emergency session. Charter was abruptly dissolved, all board. Members were removed from their positions, and Dennis was arrested 3 times and is currently being investigated, fined, and facing lawsuits. Days later, the man who attempted to destroy my life was publicly led at a golf course. Casey observed it while still in handcuffs and arguing with the arresting officer about property values and the community's perception. Occur live on her phone, and she cried out in delight, "Justice looks good on him," laughed. But because the barn was gone, I didn't truly celebrate. My dad's tool-hanging walls in the loft, where I initially instructed Casey to shoot gone, the ranch's centre had been torn out, and I spent that night sitting beside me in the ashes tank on a splintered board, gazing into the charred remnants. That's when the Wilsons, Morales, and Bakers were in the vehicle as it pulled up. By midnight, more than 30 neighbors and 15 trucks had gathered around the location of my former barn, and no one spoke. Randy, a retired trooper, came out first, gave me a shoulder pat and said, "We'll rebuild." "But no buts," he answered. "This community isn't made of fences and walls." They began removing trash. Bylaws are made up of people, and we don't leave our own behind. By dawn of that evening, local businesses were being marked with a new foundation, supplied materials, a feed shop sold timber, and the mayor even paid a visit to send a handwritten note and some freshly baked biscuits. "Clint, you reminded this town what's standing tall. It appears that we rebuilt the tank and added a new bed to the corner of Casey, painted a sign over the entrance of the new barn at the end of the week. Ashes rise." Ranch felt appropriate, but the narrative wasn't over yet since, as we, sleek black automobile arrived into my driveway as we were laying down the final row of siding, and a woman in a blue, she identified herself as Lauren Pennington, her suit heels crunching on the gravel. "We've been watching the case," stated the regional field representative for a national real estate company, "and it's encouraging." She opened a leather folder and said, "You've become quite the symbol of independence." I didn't like where this was going, and moved it over the recently constructed barn table inside a 7-day buying offer. She added the money without any problems, and only your land was developed. He gazed at the future of rural luxury, private eco-homes that are peaceful and sustainable. The amount was plenty to retire, relocate, and start over with ease, but I didn't even blink. I retracted the offer silently, and she made another attempt to ponder. About it, the value of this land has increased dramatically, and you can construct something new. I smiled slowly elsewhere, and for the first time her smile cracked. I turned around and left as soon as the battle started, but when I got to, "We'll be back with a higher offer." She yelled at the barn doors, but I didn't turn. They did come, but I made sure everyone could hear me say, "This land's not for sale, not now, not ever." Returning twice, each time with a fresh pitch, offer, and briefcase. By now, the response was consistently the same. "This land isn't for sale," even though it was polished to sound like salvation. Eventually, the woman in the blue suit stopped turning up, but her cards continued to arrive in the mail. Premier ones with Casey began, with promises of unheard-of potential and gold-embossed lettering, gathering them in a shoebox and labeling it "No means no." But despite the HOA's removal, Dennis's incarceration, and the litigation eventually going our way, the battle left us with stress repair bills and legal marks, caused doctor's appointments that don't seem on the outside until you're by yourself, thinking the wind had changed and cooler autumn was beginning to settle in the area when I walked the property with Tank in the evening weeks after the fire. With fire retardant and solar lights hidden beneath the rafters, the new barn stood taller and more impressive than the old one. The neighbors had painted the interior with paintings of goats, stars, horses, and ancient objects, and they had installed insulation between each beam. I ran my fingers over the wall and felt phrases like, "Don't tread where you ain't welcome." My father's initials, CF, were deeply engraved into the wood. I closed my eyes and saw that someone had saved one of the old beams and incorporated it into the new frame. I had calm for a while, but fate had not yet finished with me. A letter. This one arrived in a new plain envelope with no branding or return address. There was a single sheet of paper with the official U.S. Department of I received a notification from the Justice Office of Civil Litigation stating that the Fairview Ranch Estates HOA was the subject of a federal investigation for many civil zoning fraud, rights abuses, and plots to influence land ownership. Would I be willing to use the illegal papers that were attached? Testify, I initially resisted the idea of returning to the courtroom. My stomach twisted during the struggle, but Casey's words stuck. "You have always told me that refusing to flee is more important than winning. Therefore, I signed in Washington, D.C. 6. A few weeks later, I testified before a panel on the first infraction. I gave them the video, emails, and HOA meeting clips as notice of the barn fire. Marcia had leaked, and after listening and asking questions, one of the panel members, a tall man with grey around his temples and a tanned suit, leaned. "Do you believe this was personal, Mr. Foster?" he asked me, and I nodded. "Once said, yes, sir, but I also think it's happening elsewhere. Throughout the nation, there are peaceful areas where noisy individuals have just enough authority to forget who they are meant to serve." There was a pause, followed by cheers. Genuine applause from the audience behind them, not from the politicians observing. From the gallery, the agony of her HOA as a single mother, farmer, and soldier. I didn't require a medal because the moment was sufficient when I saw her tail displayed on her blouse. Arrived at home, the ranch was ready, the fields were louder than ever, and the goats were. The rainwater system had been improved, with assistance from the county, making them more environmentally friendly than they had been in years. Squirrel Casey had constructed a small bench beneath the certified and tax-deductible tank that growled at it, large oak tree beside the stream, which she dubbed the quiet spot, where neighbors continued to visit on the weekends. Children played in the fields, while elderly men sat by the fence line and discussed the past and everything. Occasionally, strangers from out of town who had heard about the case in the newspaper or watched the tale online would drive by. Documents. They would pause at the gate and request permission to look around without being buyers. As believers, I want to demonstrate to myself that one guy, one ranch, and one Loudney can still have an impact. Always embrace them, since my land is evidence that dignity doesn't originate not from wealth or titles, but rather from staying put when it would have been easier to go, and standing tall when everything is discouraging you from believing in anything and from grabbing a weapon to defend rather than hurt. That some items should never be sold. Smoke was the beginning of this tale, but it concludes with deep roots on the Ashes Rise Ranch.